There we go. All right. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, if that is how you self-identify. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mary Beth Becker-Lotz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Education and Outreach Navigator at Women's Advocates. We are a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota, offering a continuum of safety through prevention programming, emergency shelter, and aftercare housing support for victim survivors of domestic violence. Before we dive into this webinar today, I want to acknowledge and extend a whole ton of gratitude for our American Sign Language interpreters, which is provided through Think Self Minnesota Deaf Education and Advocacy, their specialized interpreting fellowship training program. So thank you, Erin and Becca, who are going to be interpreting for us today. And finally, we at Women's Advocates are so excited to have Sawyer Platts back with us from Family Tree Clinic to talk about parents as sexuality educators. We have a poll going on right now that I'm going to end and launch the results of that is talking about how comfortable or not y'all are as sexuality educators for children. Women's Advocates uses a two-generation approach to safety and healing from domestic violence. So we are super thrilled to have Sawyer here to talk about a two-generation approach to sexuality education. And with that, Sawyer, I'm just going to let you run with it.
All right, thank you so much. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Sawyer Platts. I am excited to be here again. I did a webinar back in April with Women's Advocates on consent. And so it's great to be back doing another one of these and talking with you all about one of my favorite topics to facilitate discussions on parents as sexuality educators. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody who has introduced yourselves in the chat already. It's so cool to see people joining from all over the place. When I first did this, I was thinking like, okay, yeah, we'll see some people from Minnesota, maybe some people I know, and I did, but it's also amazing to see people joining from all over the country and even like overseas, other countries, places around the world. So thank you for showing up for this and being interested. And I'm going to do my best to make this like engaging as much as we can in this virtual format. And the virtual format does give us a chance to be connected, even though we're in so many different places. So that is like one of the benefits, I suppose, of this time of distancing. So yeah, thank you. I guess I'll introduce myself the way that a lot of you all did in the chat. Again, my name is Sawyer Platts. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm the sexuality educator at Family Tree Clinic. I'll talk a little bit more about Family Tree in a second. And I live in Northeast Minneapolis with my partner and our two kids, Anthony, who is 9, and Zachary, who is about to turn 3 next month. So in looking at the poll results here, it looks like we've got lots of folks here who are parents, which makes sense that you would be joining since this is our topic. But I also want to acknowledge that there's like lots of reasons why folks might be interested in this or might be joining, even if you yourself don't have kids. Chances are, you've got nieces, nephews, maybe you have got like neighbor kids or like, godchildren or kids that you mentor, kids that you work with. So really, all of us as adults have a chance to be like a positive presence in the life of a young person, regardless of, whether we have our own kids or not. So cool that lots of folks are parents. It looks like there's diversity of age ranges too. Folks have kids birth to 5. And we've got folks here with like elementary age and teenagers and on up too. And so looking at how folks are feeling as far as confidence level, looks like there was again a range, which is so like typical. I just really want to like welcome and everybody and normalize like however you're feeling about this topic coming in, whether you're like, oh, this is the last thing that I could imagine feeling comfortable talking with kids about, to like, hey, I feel like I'm confident, I'm already kind of doing this, you know, and everybody in between. So the goal today is that hopefully everybody will feel like there's something that you've learned, something that you can like take from this, and just kind of like put into practice in a way that makes sense for you, no matter what your family situation or what your specific context is. So, yeah, so we already looked at the poll results, and again, I just want to encourage everybody that like, you all have these skills, even though like some of us may be feeling more confident or more practiced than others. This is something that everyone has the capacity to do, and do well. And so we're gonna just like take some time to go over some of the strategies and some of the mindsets, I guess, that can help like best situate us to be sexuality educators for our kids. So I also just want to introduce Family Tree Clinic a little bit, which is where I work. We're a sexual and reproductive health clinic in St. Paul, Minnesota. And that's where we are right now, although we have a brand new clinic facility that's being built currently. So we're going to be moving to Minneapolis in November of like this fall. So that's exciting. So services that we have are like everything related to sexual and reproductive health care. So like pregnancy tests and all options pregnancy counseling. Also have lots of like, you know, people can learn about and get on a variety of kinds of like birth control and pregnancy prevention. We do STI testing and treatment. We have a trans hormone care program as well for people who are transgender or who want hormone therapy to be part of a gender transition. Everything that we offer is on a sliding scale, and we take lots of kinds of insurance as well. So one of our goals is to just be really accessible for everyone, especially folks who have felt marginalized by like a lot of more mainstream healthcare settings. So we serve a lot of people who are LGBTQ, people who are low income, people of color, people of all like body sizes. We have a deafblind, and hard of hearing program that's really unique. I think it's like the only one in the country that has the advocacy and the services that we do specifically for people who are deaf, blind, and hard of hearing. And then we have our community health education department. And so that's the area that I work in. And we do presentations on all kinds of topics related to sexuality for students everywhere from, well, we have parent classes for people who have little ones, like, you know, birth to 5. We do some early childhood family education classes. We also work with students in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and we work with adults as well, doing education in correctional facilities, which we do for youth as well, youth in those facilities, treatment centers, and places like that. So yeah, and I'm the sexual health and violence prevention educator. So I have kind of a specific lens around our topics related to healthy relationships, consent, and those areas. But really, it's all related. All the topics that we teach on are part of sexuality, and it can all be part of a violence prevention strategy, and a strategy for, you know, creating a safer, better world for us and for our kids to grow up in. So that's a little bit about Family Tree. And then as far as our goals or our objectives for today, I just want to touch on those quickly. This was in the description of what you signed up for, but just want to lay out here that for our purposes today, we're going to give folks a chance to identify values about sexuality that you would like to share with your child or children in your life. And in doing that, we're going to look at some key questions like, what is sexuality? We're going to think about like your own experience, like what messages did you get about sexuality growing up? And then what are your values about sexuality now? Are they those same values? Are they different? And then how do you want to like go about sharing those with the young people in your life? So that's objective one. We'll also spend a little bit of time talking about like stages of child sexual development from birth through puberty, and just identifying like what are some typical things, what might be cause for concern. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then thirdly, we're going to just look at skills and resources to support open communication about sexuality topics. So we'll talk about like how you can be proactive and kind of like set yourself up for success, or at least, you know, things are bound to come up and feel like a surprise sometimes, but the more that you've thought about some of this stuff and the more that you can be proactive, you're more likely to feel like ready and less, you know, surprised when you get certain questions or situations come up. So we'll also talk about that, how to respond to questions. And then one of my favorite parts of this is just sharing with people all of the different books and resources that are out there that can be such a help for parents and caregivers, that really like, there's people out there who are really smart and great with like teaching kids about sexuality topics, and they've already thought a lot about this and put together some really cool books that are just like so helpful in navigating these conversations. So with all of that said as introduction, I'd like to open up a question for you all, and just like, what is sexuality? If we're, you know, this webinar is on parents as sexuality educators. And so we should probably like define that word, or just identify like, what are some of the things that would mean? So yeah, so what is sexuality, or what would that include? What kinds of things does that include? And you can just like type in the chat. That's probably the best way to do this. And then, but yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, so how an individual identifies. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, another one about identity, feelings about your body. Yeah, I'm so glad to be seeing this, because, you know, it's very easy to automatically think of like, okay, this is like, you know, the act of like what sex is, or like where did babies come from, and, you know, thinking about how to explain that to kids. And of course, those are part of what sexuality is, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's a very broad, multifaceted topic. So yeah, it includes things about identity, how things about bodies and how a person feels about their body. Yeah, curiosity about private parts and bodies in general. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, before kids know anything about what sex is, they are going to be noticing things about bodies, like their own body, other people's bodies, and feeling curious about that. So that's part of sexuality as well. And yeah, how we understand relationships. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is like just a word cloud that I had some fun putting together, thinking about like all the different components of what is included within sexuality. So it has to do with bodies and like pleasure and anatomy, so like parts and how they work, and also like hygiene, like how we take care of ourselves, how we keep ourselves safe, how we feel about our bodies, so like body image. And then along the lines of feelings, like, you know, feelings of self-esteem or like self-concept, just how a person feels about themselves, um, feelings of attraction, and also like beliefs, right? And values about things like love and relationships, and all of that. So yeah, I'm seeing in the chat too, healthiness or confidence in sexual exploration. Mm-hmm. Capacity for sexual feelings and how we understand relationships. Yeah, yeah, all of these things. Um, and that's why like I'm so happy to be a sex educator, because I think sexuality is at the very core of what makes us human, because it's about like who we are and how we understand ourselves, how we relate to other people, how we express and experience all different kinds of feelings. And so yeah, so like I chose to be a sex educator. If you're a parent out there, you kind of are or can be a sex educator by default, just because these topics are all things that come up when you're raising kids, or even if you just spend time around kids. And so knowing how you can like have conversations about kids and just really, or about sexuality with kids, can really help set a tone for um, them to approach sexuality from a place of um, like health and positivity, and without the shame and the stigma and kind of like the secrecy or the discomfort that a lot of us were maybe raised with. And so looking at this whole like word cloud and thinking about like your own upbringing, I'm going to give people a minute to think about and then to share in the chat if you would like. What were some messages about sexuality that you received growing up? So this could be anything about like any of the concepts that you see on the screen here, or just anything that comes to mind when asked that question. What did you learn? Yep, between a man and a woman only. Mm-hmm. Wait until marriage. Yes, very common. I got both of those messages too. Not supposed to talk about it or reference it. Keep private parts private. Shameful, dirty, didn't talk about it. Yeah, masturbation or self-pleasure is a sin. Or, yep, sex for reproduction. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, this is a lot of these are the answers that we always hear when we do this talk. And it doesn't, you know, often with people who are from older generations, yes, but even like now, these are still often like the values and the messages that people are growing up with. Yeah, so I'm seeing respect and boundaries. Okay. Someone's parent was a nurse and talked about sex as if it was normal. Okay, but always an undertone of danger, or like being a woman, and that's, yeah, and that being a concern. Interesting. Yeah, thank you everybody for sharing what you've shared. And it's good to like check in with ourselves, because if we're thinking about like, okay, how can we teach kids about these things and how can we engage in conversation, it's really important to like reflect on the messages that we have grown up with ourselves. Because even if there's certain aspects of what we've learned or been told that maybe we don't agree with anymore, those messages can still kind of like be in our heads and affect the way that we respond, or might even like influence the look on our face when a kid asks a certain question or something. So being aware of like how the messages that we got and how those have shaped us is like step one in thinking about how you can be an effective like sex educator for kids in your life. So thinking about how like messages that you got, and then going forward, like what your values are now. I'd like to ask folks, what are some examples of values about sexuality that you would like to share with kids? Your kids, kids that you have a relationship with. Yeah, what would you want them to know? Okay, so normalizing aspects of sexuality, consent. Yep, that's huge. Love and respect yourself. Don't rush it. It's your own. Yeah, I love these answers that you all are sharing. Thank you for being so engaged with this. Yeah, your body and your emotions are normal. You have a right to enjoy it or say no, be your authentic self. Yeah. Dangers as well. Safer sex practices are important. Yeah. Love all this. Enthusiastic consent. Yes. Yes. Yes, these are great. This list makes me so happy to see all of these beautiful ideas in the chat. All types of bodies are good. Yes. Yes, they are. All right. So when thinking about defining your values, when we talk about values, there's, of course, there's very specific values, which are going to like vary according to the individual or the family, culture, or the belief system. So these are going to be things like, your personal, or maybe you and your partner's view on like what might be a good age to start dating, or under what circumstances should a person have sex, or like what are your values about marriage or different kinds of relationships, like monogamy, being with just one person, or polyamory, like person having multiple partners. So like these concepts are things that people are going to have different views on, and different values, and that is like 100% like up to you to decide on that, and to share that with your kids and people in your life. And then there's universal values, right? Like, and these are the ones that we will focus on the most today. Values that are held by just about everybody. And it's a lot of what I'm seeing people continuing to put in the chat here, which is great. Like, wanting your kids to know that they can come to you with questions. They can be open, they can talk to you about what's on their mind. Because really, even though people are going to have different experiences and values around certain aspects of sexuality, across the board, it's pretty much consensus that parents and caregivers want kids to feel safe and healthy and connected to their families and to their communities. They want their kids to be respectful of other people's identities. They want their kids to understand what consent is, and to be able to advocate for themselves and what they need. And you as a parent, or as like a caring, trusted adult in a young person's life, can really play an important role in helping them to have these things, and to feel healthy and safe, and good about themselves as they're growing up. So another reason why we talk about values in the beginning is just and I'll share a story here that we often tell, that a number of years ago, we were doing like a workshop for 8th graders and their parents. And so it was the kind of thing where we like, they started out all together and then they went in their separate rooms, like the parents were together and the 8th graders were together over here, and the parents were asked, you know, like, what have you taught your kids about sexuality so far? Or it was like a similar question to what I just posed to you all. Like, what values do you want to share with your kids? And a lot of the parents said, you know, that like sexuality is like natural and beautiful and healthy, and you know, we want our kids to know like there's nothing wrong with you, and you can come to us with questions, and you can you know, you can be yourself, like all these beautiful positive things. And so that's what they valued, those parents, and that's what they had intended to communicate to their kids, or what they had planned and hoped to communicate with their kids. And so then in the room next door, the 8th graders were asked, like, you know, what have your parents taught you about sex so far? Or just like, what have you learned? And they gave a lot of the same answers that that you all gave in the beginning, of like, oh, it's bad and risky and wrong and don't do it. And you know, you'll be in trouble, you'll get someone pregnant, you'll get an STD, like all of these kind of negative things. And these were, you know, so there were very different, there can be a real discrepancy sometimes between the messages that we want to send to kids and the messages that kids end up receiving. And so like, how can that be the case, right? Even especially in this situation where it's like, these are kids and their own parents, like right next door, having this kind of disconnect between what had been intended and what had been received, at least so far. And I think that's like really common for a couple of reasons. One is that people really, in society, there are lots of messages about sexuality, and there are lots of mixed messages, right? We hear that, you know, from the media and just different, you know, places in pop culture, and that, you know, sex is amazing, it's exciting, something you should want, it's a status symbol, but also there's all kinds of messages that it's like taboo, or that it's wrong in a lot of contexts, or that it's shameful or embarrassing, or something to keep quiet or hidden. So all those mixed messages can be confusing for kids. And then there's just, I think, the tendency of parents to be more reactionary than proactive. And it's again, it's because these topics can be kind of uncomfortable to talk about. Like, very few adults are just like, you know, naturally maybe feel like they know exactly what to say. I mean, I like chose to be a sex educator, and you know, sometimes I still will feel a little bit nervous talking about these things, or when I'm talking with my own kids, finding the right words for things. Sometimes, you know, it might not feel like it comes naturally. But again, if we kind of avoid it as much as possible until something comes up, like let's say, you know, you might be riding in the car and like a kind of sexy song comes on the radio or something, and your child or your niece or nephew like starts singing along with it, and you're like, what, you know this song, you shouldn't be listening to that. Or, you know, even just like turning it off, or any kind of like negative reaction that you might have at first can send a message that like there is something bad about sexuality, or that this child like did something wrong to have heard that song, or to know the words, or something like that. Same with, you know, if a scene comes on and people are like kissing on TV, or making some kind of reference to sexuality, if you get kind of uncomfortable, or like want to turn it off and not say anything about why, and it very well may be something that is like beyond what you consider appropriate for their age, and that's totally okay. But if you just kind of shut it down without a conversation, or giving any like context for why, that can just send the message that like, oh, this was bad. So that can be, I think, why some of that like negativity can be what kids feel or like what they remember from sometimes the very few moments of conversation that there are around sexuality with their parents and caregivers. So next, I'm just going to go into what are some basic like talking tips for having discussions about healthy sexuality with kids. These are based on research, but just, disclaimer about that the research that's out there, of course, does not represent every single family structure or every culture. And we have gotten feedback from a diversity of parents that the content of this presentation like resonates and is helpful. But of course, like all of this is like sample language. So feel free to take what feels useful for you and set aside the rest and adapt anything for your own family, your own context, and what'll work for you. So the first concept or talking tip is just to talk early and talk often. So we get a lot of questions, a lot of people wondering like, what's the right age to tell kids about this? When do you start talking about it? And of course, there's such a like prevailing kind of message that like they're too young to hear about certain things. But really it's like, because sexuality is so broad and there's so much opportunity to do education about it in a developmentally appropriate way, it's really never too early to start. And it's also never too late. So like if you've got kids that are, not toddlers anymore and you haven't talked with them a lot about this stuff, that's okay. It's not too late to start. But you can start when they're as young as babies, like when you're changing their diapers, when you're getting them like into the bathtub. You can teach them about the names for their body parts, for example. And we recommend using the medical names for body parts. So like instead of the kind of like cutesy or silly nicknames that people will often give to different body parts, especially like for the genitals, like it's better to just use the words like penis, testes, vagina, vulva. And that's good for a few reasons. Like one, it's just like most accurate. And so you're giving kids information about their bodies and they're learning new words all the time. So they don't have any reason to feel funny or embarrassed about those words unless they get the message that those parts are something to feel funny and embarrassed about. But if, they're learning, like, you're washing them up in the tub, you can be like, I'm gonna wash your shoulder, I'm gonna wash your elbow, I'm gonna wash your knees, gonna wash your penis, gonna wash your ankles, and kind of like make it a game. That also gives you practice saying those words out loud too, and not having to like maybe feel as embarrassed as you might imagine feeling when you're talking to like a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old, right? The other reason why it's really important for kids to know the right words for those parts is that it's a sexual abuse prevention strategy. Because the more that kids are able to name their body parts and talk clearly and like in a straightforward way about their bodies and like what's happening, the more that they'll be able to advocate for themselves and share if something inappropriate is happening. And one example that I'll just give is a story we heard once from another ECFE teacher, like an early childhood family educator, who shared a story that there was a little girl who I think was maybe like 3-4 years old, who was saying that this like other child at the daycare was touching her cookie. And so at first the daycare providers were kind of like, okay, well, do you want a different cookie or what? What's going on? They thought it was like about the cookie. And then it took a while to realize that what was actually happening is that another child was touching her vulva and like, and she was like trying to share that with the adults in the setting, but it wasn't communicating it in a way that they could understand because she was using this nickname of cookie instead of, just telling using the accurate word for the part. So that is, that's just like a really concrete example of how, when we give kids the language to be able to talk about what's happening, we empower them to be able to like get help, get the attention that they need, whether it's, inappropriate touching happening, or even if just something is hurting or not feeling right, we give them the language that they can like communicate with about that. And they know that there isn't anything wrong with those words. There's nothing bad about talking about their bodies and like being in touch with what's going on with them and speaking up about it. And there are some really great kids books out there that can help with this. Some people may have heard of the Bare Naked book. It's kind of older. It came out in 1986. And so I was really happy to see that there's a new version of it that just came out in 2021. And I've got a copy of it. It's one of my son's favorites right now. But this newer one shows a lot more diversity of like body types and different like skin tones, cultural identities, different kinds of like abilities, a lot more diversity than what was shown in the other book. And then it's got, so for example, the page where they're showing like, and talking about genitals, it just says like, different people have different kinds. Whatever you call, whatever you have, your genitals belong to you. And so it also talks about it in a way that's not as gendered and is a little more like, inclusive for people whose gender identity might be different than what their body parts are. And what's also helpful about these pictures for young kids is that, it's like, it's got these drawings where there's kids who are naked, but it's also showing them like, in the bathroom, getting dressed, and that kind of thing. So it can also be an opportunity to talk about like, how private parts are private. And there's times when it's okay to be naked and when we need to be naked, because like when we're getting clean or when we're, going to the bathroom. But that, there's settings where we're not going to be naked because that's just like not what we do. So it kind of helps to reinforce that. So I can keep going because we've got a lot more talking tips to go through, but I want to be keeping my eye on the chat here. I'm not sure if people have any like questions or comments at this point especially about this idea of talking early and talking often. Like any questions about like, what is the right age to do something or to bring something up? We'll also have time for questions throughout and hopefully at the end too. But I just wanted to give a minute for people to bring something up about that if you would like. We've also got a copy of this, this other one that there's a picture of. This is a newer one that came out too. It's just very straightforward and good for young kids. Like, these are my eyes, this is my nose, this is my vulva, these are my toes, and just kind of goes through lots of different things about bodies in a way where it's like, oh, we're learning and we can feel like happy and proud about like the body parts we have and like what our bodies can do. Yeah. All right. So I'll move on to the next one then. Oh, this this kind of goes with our second objective. And I'm seeing a good question here in the chat that comes up a lot. What if other people, like teachers or grandparents, are using other non-medical names? Yeah, that is going to be something that happens where like the other adults that the child is dealing with is like using some other term. And you know, you can decide based on your relationship with those adults if you want to share with them like, hey, here's why we just use the word penis or vulva. Like it's, you know, it's important for them to understand and to know the real words. And, you know, you can give them like some of the spiel that I just said about how it helps with body safety and things like that. It's also okay to just talk with your own kids and be like, yeah, grandma likes to use, you know, whatever word it is. And she didn't maybe learn that it's actually okay and totally fine to just like use the real words too. And sometimes it can feel kind of like silly or kind of fun to call it by these other nicknames. But I just want you to know that the real word, or like the word that a doctor would use for this part, is penis, or is like nipples, or whatever it might be. And so you can use that as a moment to just like share with your child why like you in your family are going to most of the time or all the time call it by its medical name, and just say that, yeah, sometimes other people don't know that or haven't had a chance to learn that it's okay just to call it by the real word. And then kids are usually like, okay, and that's fine. Right. And yeah, seen in the chat, have these same conversations with older generations who probably didn't grow up with this kind of language or like straightforward naming of things. And so it can be hard for them to imagine doing it themselves. But yeah, it really is, it's not too soon, and it's not too late either. So with the idea of like what is considered like typical, a lot of times people might not think that there's anything sexual that like a young child or like a birth to 4-year-old would be doing. But this is just a screenshot of a document that's available from Sex Positive Families, which is a really good, amazing website with lots of great information and resources on it. So there's a whole like packet that you can download that includes, like, this is just the birth to age 4 sheet, but there's also like, you know, ages like 5 to 10 and then like 11 to 15, and gives examples of like what is typical, what might be some concerning signs, and then how you can work in like teachable moments for all of these things. So yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll just like, I'll send out the a copy of this document, and maybe I'll just put in the chat actually the a link to this so that people have it right now if you want to take a look. Okay, good. Yeah, so this, you can just kind of scroll down and see what are the typical behaviors for these age ranges, what might be concerning, and then what are some go-to resources for those ages as well. So yeah, moving along to our next talking tip, which is it's about the music, not the lyrics. So this has to do with the idea of like it can be very easy to get caught up in the words and being like, okay, I have to like say this right. But really there's no script that you have to follow. There's not like exact words that you need to say. The most important thing is just to focus on the values and like the core message that you want to share with your child and keep that as the goal. Because kids aren't going to remember every single word that we say to them, but they're often going to remember how they felt about the conversation. And so thinking about your tone of voice, your body language, the feel that you can create in the conversation, whether you're bringing something up like proactively or if it's the way that you're responding to a question, that really goes a long way towards either creating the feeling like, oh, this is like interesting and positive and normal to be learning about, versus like, oh, this is uncomfortable and icky and weird. There's a lot that's where that like it's the music, not the lyrics piece kind of comes in. And so these are just a couple more books that we recommend. These are both by the same author. What Makes a Baby and then Sex is a Funny Word. Sorry, that picture is kind of blurry. But these are by Corey Silverberg, who is a great like child educator on different sexuality topics. And I just want to like read a couple pages out of this because this gives some examples of like how you can like talk to a very young child about where babies come from in a way that's just kind of like whimsical and fun and doesn't have anything to do with like the act of sex yet, but it can like, so like, here's just a couple little excerpt here. So when an egg and a sperm meet, they swirl together in a special kind of dance. As they dance, they talk to each other. So here it's got like these like kind of like cartoon pictures of a sperm and an egg. And then it says, the egg tells the sperm all the stories it has to tell about the body it came from. And the sperm tells the egg all the stories it has to tell about the body it came from. So it's the idea that like, you know, it came from these, sperm came from one body and egg came from another body. They've got stories, they're sharing them. When their dance is done, they are not two things anymore. They danced around and shared so much that they became one brand new thing. And then at first, this is just a tiny thing. Sometimes this tiny thing does not grow, and sometimes it grows into a baby, like you did. And then it says, who helped bring together the sperm and egg that made you? Who was happy that it was you who grew? So another really cool thing about that whole framing is that it's so open and inclusive for any kind of family, whether there's like, even if there's like same gender parents, if there's an adoption that's part of that family story, it's much more expansive than just like mom and dad. Talks about how like the sperm and the egg are what is needed to make a baby. And as long as those come together, that can, you know, you can end up with a baby. And who brought together the sperm and egg that made you? It's a way to kind of put your particular family's story into this framing and talk with the child about like where they came from, in whatever way feels right at that age. And then Sex is a Funny Word is by the same author. And so it's got a lot of kind of the same feel, although it's more for, I would say like 8 to 11. It's called A Book About Bodies, Feelings, and You. It's just another good one that we recommend. All right, moving on to another talking tip. Open communication is key. And so this is pretty, maybe kind of self-explanatory, but just the idea that the more that you can establish like an open feeling with your kids or the kids in your life, that you are there for them, you are approachable, you are an askable adult, like someone that they can come to with questions that they have, and that you're there to really like answer their questions and also listen, and to make sure that you understand what's really being asked. So I'll just share an example from my own upbringing where I think I was about 6 or so, and I asked my mom, like, what is sex? And I remember she got really kind of quiet and uncomfortable seeming and was sort of like, I think we should talk about that, not right now, later, maybe with your dad. Or she said something to kind of like put it off. And so I was like, okay, we didn't end up talking about it then. But then 2 days later, they did sit me down and we had a whole conversation where they explained all about like the physical act of what sex is and where babies come from. And they were doing the very best they could. And they did a good job in a lot of ways, I think, because they didn't just completely sweep it under the rug. But what they didn't ask is just like, oh, like, where did you hear that word? Or like, what made you wonder about that? Because the reason that I had been asking about what is sex is that we had this Berenstain Bears book that was like, some of you might be familiar with those books. It was like, Berenstain Bears go out for the team. So it was like brother and sister bear are playing baseball, and brother or his friend or something makes some kind of comment that like girls can't play baseball, or so, like no girls allowed. And sister bear was like, that's a sexist remark. And that was the word sexist that I wanted to ask about. And so I knew it had something to do with like the idea of boys and girls, and like the idea that boys are better than girls or something. And so like that's what I wanted to ask about. But I had also heard of the word sex by itself too. And so anyway, so I was just like very surprised and not really prepared for the answer that I got. And like no harm was done at all, but like I think it's a good example of like if we ask kids, especially it can also help in a moment where we maybe feel caught off guard and aren't quite sure what to say. Just asking them a follow-up question like, well, so what made you think to ask that? Or why are you wondering about that? Just gives an insight into like what they're really thinking and like where the question or the wondering is coming from. And so, yeah, and like these kinds of conversations can just feel like uncomfortable sometimes, or sometimes something might come up and it just feels like it's not the right time. So it is also perfectly fine to say like, you know what, I'm really glad you asked about that. I might need some time to think about the best way to explain that. Or I might want to check with, if there's another, like, let's say maybe you aren't the parents, but it's like, a child that you have a relationship with. Maybe you're thinking like, I'm not sure how much to say, and maybe I do want to check in with their parent before we go for it. Like, that's okay. But always just responding with genuine, like, I'm glad you asked that, affirming the question, whatever it is, trying to get as much of a real sense as you can about where it's coming from is always helpful. And then if you feel discomfort or like you want to be in a different situation, or need more time, that's okay. It can be easier to talk about some of this stuff when you're like doing something else, like doing the dishes, or especially as kids get older, sometimes they feel more comfortable too if you're doing kind of a side-by-side activity, or like you're in the car together. Sometimes that can feel put both of you at ease a little more than just being face to face. But yeah, just taking the time to listen, asking kids like, what they really think, where they're coming from, is always a good guideline to have. So a couple more books that are just like good ones, good resources and aids in exploring sexuality topics with kids. Some people might have heard of It's Not the Stork. That's the first in a series of 3 books. This one here, I've just got an example of it here. It's Not the Stork, a book about girls, boys, babies, bodies, families, and friends. And so this one is a little bit more gendered in its language than it would need to be. And I mean, it's very like, it's kind of like girls have these parts and boys have these parts, and kind of like, I'm sure trying to have clarity, it's not as inclusive of people of other gender identities, which is why it's great that there's also alternatives. I don't have a picture of this one on the screen, but there's one called the Everybody Book, the LGBTQ Inclusive Guide for Kids about sex, gender, bodies, and families. That's a good one. And then It's Not the Stork is recommended for ages 4 and up. It's pretty thick, and it's kind of like in a cartoon style. It's got these funny little characters. It's a bird and a bee that kind of are like the narrators all throughout the thing. And then the next one after that is called It's So Amazing. And it's, and then same author. More about this one, a book about eggs, sperm, birth, babies, and families. And then there's It's Perfectly Normal, which is the same author, kind of last in the series of 3 that's recommended for 10 and up. And it's a really good, like, comprehensive resource for like helping kids learn about puberty and understand like the ways that bodies change, the way that new feelings come about. It talks about like crushes and attraction and sex, and it talks about like different kinds of sexual activities in a straightforward way. And some people have considered all of this controversial, but it's often people who aren't really comfortable with kids having any kind of sexuality education. But whenever it's been studied, it's been shown that kids who have access to information about sexuality actually have better health outcomes across the board. Like they have fewer unplanned pregnancies, they have fewer STIs, they have better mental health, they're able to be more in touch with their own identities, and more understanding of like the different identities of people around them. So again, this is all like out there, you can take it or leave it, but these books can really help provide a framework and language for talking about sexuality. Oh, and the Wait What is another great one for puberty and kind of like early teens. Comic book guide to relationships, bodies, and growing up. It's a newer one that's it's very like gender inclusive, and it's one of my favorites for sure. So talking about the joys of sexuality, this kind of like touched on this idea already, but just trying to like keep in mind that sexuality is just like a broad concept that like relates to any person, no matter what age they are. So it's not just about like talking about what sex is, it's all those different things that we identified earlier. So it's relationships, love, bodies, gender, feelings, values, babies, growing up, all of that. And so of course, there are some values that you probably want to share with your kids about like safety and like decision making and how to like you know, especially as they get older, making healthy decisions about sexuality and how they can like minimize the risk of STIs, things like that. While we want to make sure they know that there are like risks involved, making sure to balance that message with that just the underlying value that sexuality is natural and healthy, and that loving relationships and intimacy can be some of the best like parts of life. So there's lots of really any of the books that I've mentioned and that come on our list that we recommend kind of fit with this talking tip. But just another one I'll mention here is this Tell Me About Sex, Grandma. It's a kid's book, but it can, I mean, there's things in it that can be helpful for a person of any age. I think it's about a kid who comes home from school and asks, why is sex a bad word? And the grandma is like, well, it's not a bad word, you know, like who told you that? And so then there's this very sweet conversation that unfolds in the book with this kid and his grandma about like what sexuality is and the different like things that go into it and how it's like your sexuality belongs to you. And so it has like very kind of empowering message too about like your body, your choice, like that kind of stuff. Using teachable moments is a great strategy, and it's like next on our list of talking tips. TV, movies, social media, internet, books, daily conversations and interactions that come up bring up lots of opportunities to talk about topics related to sexual health. So maybe you experience like not really hearing about sex much growing up, and then you like parents sitting you down for like the talk, or like, you know, the idea that there's kind of one big talk that happens at a certain age, like, you know, when somebody gets their period, or when, you know, somebody is like going into high school or whatever. That's just like gonna put a lot more pressure on you, the adult, to try to like talk about everything all in one conversation. And there's just like no way to actually do that. And so having lots of little conversations over time, from the time that kids are little, as they grow up in their elementary years and in their teens and even beyond that, is much more manageable and effective than the idea of like there being one kind of high stakes moment where you put it all out there and then that's it. So yeah, just looking for opportunities to like weave it into the show you're watching or the book you're reading, or, you know, something that you overheard someone else say. Another kid's book that's a cute one based on a true story of these penguins, these two boy penguins who wanted to be dads, and so they raised the penguin egg. That's And Tango Makes Three. Is just a cute story and a great way to explore the idea that there are like different kinds of families, and some families have a mom and a dad, some families have two dads or two moms, some families have a mom and a stepmom and a dad, or, you know, like a single dad or a single mom, right? I mean, there's so much diversity in different kinds of families and living situations. And so that's something that you can probably just observe and talk with kids about in your life, you know, through people that you know. And there's great books out there too that provide the chance for that. And then I think this is the last one on our list of talking tips. Just the idea that it's important to not make assumptions about your child's identities. And so If you want your child to talk with you about their identities, like who they are and how they're feeling, let them know that you will love them no matter what. It's very easy for parents to assume that their kids are going to be straight, like heterosexual, and that their kids are going to be cisgender, or that they are going to identify with the gender that everyone assumed they were when they were born, right? And that may be the case, that that's who they are, but it might not be. And so if you want them to know that it would be okay with you and that you would love them and accept them, even if they're gay, even if they're transgender, if they're bisexual, like stating that very clearly is the best way to do that. And just affirming that there are many ways to be, and the more specific that you can be, the more clearly your child will hear the message that it is okay for them to be themselves, no matter what that means. You can say things like I'll love you no matter what, and that's great. Like a kid can't hear that enough. But if a kid is noticing that they're feeling like they have a crush on someone of the same gender, or maybe they're starting to feel like maybe they don't even really fit as the gender that everyone thinks they are, they might and probably will feel nervous to bring that up. And so even if you've like in families where people assume that like, oh, of course my kid would know that that's okay, just like coming right out and like talking openly and in an accepting way of transgender people or of LGBTQ people, if you want them to know that that would be okay with you, like really stating that so that they don't have to wonder and fear and guess what the reaction might be, will really like help to create that safe feeling that they can be open about that kind of thing. And there's all kinds of things that adults sometimes do that really reinforce expectations or of like them being straight, that maybe we aren't trying to send that message, but the ways that adults will ask a second grader, like a second grade boy, like, oh, so do you have a girlfriend? Or even like the ways that people talk to toddlers sometimes about like, oh, like he's such a little flirt, or kind of like suggesting that there's sexualized things that kids are doing or thinking about well before they actually are meaning to do any of that. It's a way that it sends a message that like that's how you're going to be, right? And that's the normal way to be, and those kind of things are not as helpful for the affirming that there's many ways to be, and that also it's okay for them not to be thinking about crushes and flirting and any of that at those ages, because they're really not. It's adults who come up with those ideas sometimes, and it's it's really not what is developmentally where they're at. So I want to stop. I know I kind of just like went all the way through those talking points there, but I want to see if there are more like questions or comments about these talking tips that we've gone through, or like, comments, questions, or like any situations that people have encountered that felt tricky, or that you would like want to ask about how to handle. Not that I have like all the answers or anything, but this is a chance where we can discuss and share about some of that. And while people are thinking and perhaps typing, I do just want to comment on the books that are pictured here. The Who Are You? A Kid's Guide to Gender Identity is a cool one and can also be helpful for adults who want to understand these topics. And it's got, let's see, I'm just gonna show you how it's set up. This is a story about you. The important thing to remember is that you are the one who knows you best. And it has just a very like accessible way of explaining like what sex assigned at birth. It doesn't use that term at all. It says when babies are born, people ask, is it a boy or a girl? Babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. And then it goes on to explain like often they guessed right. But as babies grow into kids, they start to know what they like and don't like, and know more about who they are. And so it talks about gender identity and just like preferences, and like it gives this whole page where there's a shelf with all different toys, and then it's just like, what do you like? And so a kid could look at this and say like, I like, you know, the blocks and the soccer ball and the dinosaur and the doll. And there doesn't have to be a feeling of, you know, that there's like a boy shelf and a girl shelf and like right and wrong answers when it comes to what you want to play with or what you want to wear. Yeah, so that is another helpful one, especially with gender stuff, whether it's a kid who's, you know, wanting to just share with, introduce the idea that, you know, people have a gender identity, a sense of who they are that might match or not match with what people assumed based on their bodies. But also just how wide of an array of like gender expression there is. So like that's, you know, the way that people outwardly express their gender. So through like clothing choices or hairstyle or like interests, and how like it's okay to be drawn to whatever you're drawn to, and there aren't like rules. If that's a value that you have, it is helpful to share that with kids that that's the case. So yeah, I'm just wondering if folks have questions or comments. I'm kind of at the end of the content that I have for you all as far as like tips and slides and things like that. More resources for adults that I want to make sure to highlight here too are Sex Positive Families, which I already touched on in the beginning. It's a really good website. Melissa Pintor Carnegie is like, I feel like I've learned so much about being a sexuality educator from her website and the stuff that she writes. So yeah, so check out that site if you're looking for info and ideas. And she also wrote a book called Sex Positive Talks to Have with Kids. And it's got, let's see, a guide to raising sexually healthy, informed, empowered young people. And it's got like all kinds of conversation starters and lots of really specific like scenarios and like sample language that you can use for responding to different like kinds of like questions and situations, and some of the stuff that can feel most tricky to navigate, like how to talk to kids about things like porn. And she's got like really good guidance on that. So yeah, I would highly recommend. And then, oh, I want to make sure that I share with you all our handout that we always make available from Family Tree. We've got a packet that where the first page is like all the same talking tips that we just went over, but then the rest of it is a little more specific guidelines on responding to different questions and things like that. So let me just share that here. Actually, I'm not sure if I have a link open right now that everyone else is going to be able to open. So I'm seeing, okay. In the chat here, we've got, in your opinion, is it good to share also personal experience in a respectful way, or this might predetermine or send the message that this is the right way? Yeah, well, so I think, I don't know if the question is about kind of like, if it's good for an adult to share like what some of their like past experiences have been with like dating and relationships, or like what their experience has been with maybe coming to terms with like aspects of their identity. Generally, I think it is helpful for kids to hear like from elders, whether it's like, you know, someone who's much older than them, or even just like, you know, a bit older than them. I think as long as it's framed in a way that you're speaking from like your own experience and how it felt for you and what you learned from it. And as long as, you know, there's some like boundaries in place that feel comfortable for you and for them, as far as what level of like personal detail is being shared. I think that's important to keep in mind, but that just like hearing about, you know, from the adults in your life, like what kind of experiences they had with puberty, or with crushes, or with a first date, or, you know, it can be really like helpful to hear that. So yeah, I don't think it would necessarily determine that there's one right way, or that there's a way that you have to be, as long as it's framed that way. That it's just like your experience, and that they may have their own experience and own interpretation of things. Yeah. What else? There's also amaze.org is a really good website that has lots of short animated videos that are great for kids that are, I always feel like the age range is kind of like 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe kind of in that like pre-puberty or like early puberty, but lots of on like bodies, changes, growing up, relationships, all that kind of stuff. They've got some really good things. And then there's a podcast called 6 Minute Sex Ed, that is by a sex educator named Kim Cavill, who just like puts together these really brief, like literally 6-minute episodes about all different kinds of topics that relate to sexuality in some way. And she has them identified as level like 1, 2, or 3, for like if they are meant for listening to like with your kid, and it's like developmentally appropriate for like any age, including younger kids, or if it's meant more for like preteens or teens. She has them like identified that way so that they can be So you kind of know if it's meant more for like the parent to get a, some key info that they can then share with your kids, or is it best, or is it one that you can just like sit together and like listen to it and talk about it right then? Yeah. All right, I think that might be, oh, okay, yeah, a couple more things. So there's an age by age guide to talking to kids about gender. That is a really good article that I think I do have the link to. Just share that one. And then I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second here and see if I can pull up the family tree one. Okay, so this, let's see if I can, you all will be able to access it this way. I know I'm sharing the screen right now, but sorry, y'all. Here. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to follow up with this one separately, or just like do it, yeah, as an email attachment. But I'll go back here and just kind of show you some things on it. So yeah, so these are some of the talking tips that we just went through. This is some guidance for when questions come up. This is some examples of questions that you might get, some guidance on how to answer tough questions, and kind of like making sure you're keeping your voice and your face calm, affirming the question, that kind of stuff. Resources for parents. One thing that I know I didn't talk about in a lot of detail is like keeping kids safe from sexual abuse. Again, remember we talked about how like teaching them the correct terms for their body parts is a really like great foundation for that. Also just talking about like private parts, and like those parts are just for you. No one should touch your private parts, and you shouldn't touch anyone else's private parts. There are certain situations where someone will need to touch your private parts, for example, and then you can talk really specifically about like, again, depending on if your kids are at this age, when you're doing diaper, potty time, in the bath, or at the doctor's office, right? And then there's this section is in the packet that you'll all get. This Stop It Now, Minnesota. These are some behavioral and physical warning signs that a child may have been abused. So some things to look at there. And then, oh yeah, this is what I was looking for. So our body safety rules. These are, I just mentioned some of them. But you can even like have this up like in your house, or like print this and show kids, that kind of like make it normalize that there's like body safety rules, and reinforce that we don't keep secrets. We can have surprises. There's a difference between a surprise and a secret. Like we could have, we don't want to tell dad or grandma like what their birthday present is, because that's going to be a surprise. Or we're having like a surprise party for so and so, so we don't want to we want to keep that because that's a surprise, but we don't keep secrets. Because asking kids to keep secrets, even about things like, like, oh, don't tell mom I got a speeding ticket, or, that kind of thing, it can send this message that like, it's okay for kids to be asked to keep secrets for adults. And that's just like, if you want to have that like open communication, and also like especially reinforcing that there's not secrets about touching or things like that. That's a very basic, important strategy for keeping kids safe from sexual abuse. So yeah, I'm gonna stop that share, and then I'm just gonna see, is there anything that I missed in the comments?
Oh, we do have something, Sawyer, from Amy in the chat. If
Okay.
my 12-year-old told me last year that she likes both boys and girls while we were driving, my response was, oh, okay, that's cool. She said, oh, you're not mad? And I said, no, and we've not really touched on it much. Should there be more conversation with her moving forward, or should we let her come to us when she wants to talk more about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And I'm glad that she felt like she could share that with you, and that that your response was so like accepting and positive. And yeah, it's interesting though that like she, I think a lot of kids, even if they grow up in a family that's very like open and, affirming of lots of different identities, because it's still like, not what is considered the norm in a lot of cases, it shows like she was kind of nervous maybe about what you thought. And so I think it could be good to bring it up again, if you feel like there's a time when that makes sense, just to be like, hey, so remember how you shared that with me before? Like, yeah, I mean, there's a number of directions you could go with it. You could just be like, again, thanks for sharing that. I know maybe that you might have been kind of like unsure about how I would respond, but I'm really glad that you felt like you could share that with me, because I just like want to know you, and I want you to feel like comfortable telling me things that are important to you. And so just again to affirm that she shared it with you. If you wanted to ask a little more about like why she thought you might be mad, that could be a conversation starter if you wanted to take it in that direction. You could also just say, do you have any updates about that? Which may come across as like a, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a crush or something, which is an okay question. I think as long as, I think it's important for kids to know that there isn't like pressure, that like it's okay if they don't have a crush or a relationship or like a girlfriend or boyfriend. And because I think kids can get a lot of messages that, from adults like, well, don't have sex and don't do this or that risky thing. But they also, because adults do kind of like to ask sometimes, like, do you have a boyfriend? Are you going to prom? Like, they can feel this pressure that it's like they're not normal, or that there's something like wrong with them if they're not doing those things. And so I think just always reinforcing like, you're okay, you're fine, I love you, you're great, is key, and just really helpful for like framing the whole tone that you have in the relationship. But yeah, thanks for asking that.
Amazing. Any last questions for Sawyer before we wrap up this morning, early afternoon?
Yeah, anything else? I'm just gonna type my contact information in the chat as well. Make sure I spelled everything right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if thank you so much everybody for attending and participating and all your like great questions and comments and stuff in the chat. And if you have any follow-up questions that you want to ask, please like feel free to contact me. You're also going to get an email that will have the handout that I couldn't quite share with you, as well as, you know, the links to the other things I referenced. And if you are in the Twin Cities or like, yeah, if wherever you are interested in a presentation, potentially from Family Tree Clinic, you can contact me about that as well, and we can maybe set something up. So.
Excellent. I'm going to stop recording now.